Hi, Sublation Media viewers. It's me, Douglas Lane, and Ashley Frawley. We're going to be talking about Claudine Gay and what I like to call the censorship industrial complex. There we go. That's suddenly couldn't come to mind. But I am going to be counterintuitive, contrarian, and say that Claudine Gay is a victim of the cancel culture. And we'll explore just what that means. I
That's
know
not
that
counterintuitive. I agree with you. I think that's
people
obvious.
in the people in the comments are saying things like, "I regret to inform you that a second Claudine Gay has hit the Student Plagiarism Center." So we'll have to address some of that in the that sentiment in the comments. Actually, it's actually totally accurate. But anyhow, this is the Sublation Magazine show. Thank you for watching, and we'll be running the intro, and then we'll be back.
In the case of nuclear or radiological fallout, people living around potential targets such as military bases and chemical plants may be advised to evacuate.
Oh, okay, so I have to take that comment off the screen if I
Whoops.
can. All
Hide
right.
current comment. Okay. And we'll just show another one by mistake. Right. So unless you've been living under a rock for the past couple of weeks, you may be unaware. You may be aware of the fact that Claudine Gay was recently accused of plagiarism, or was a subject to a plagiarism scandal, and has since stepped down. And most people are seeing this as a triumph, right? There you go. You get what you give, and it exposes the rot at the heart of academia. And I agree with that latter point. I do think that the fact that she was elevated to such a position on such flimsy credentials does speak to the rot at the heart of academia. And anybody who's been part of academia, in case you don't know, my name is Ashley Frawley. I'm a sociologist at the University of Kent. I was associate professor at Swansea University for 10 years. So I've been working in academia for quite a long time. And there is this sort of social climbing that goes on. Academia is tough. There are a lot of people who want to get into it. Doug, why are you laughing?
I'm just laughing at how you went. I've been working for in academia for quite a long time, and then as if you're confessing, and there's a lot of social climbing that goes on. But keep going.
No, look, like it took me a long time to get to associate professor because I'm stupid, and I have no sense of, I'm not stupid in the sense of like my academic credentials or my ability to publish or whatever, but that didn't have a sense or an instinct for self-preservation. In that I wanted to help out the team, and I took on a massive teaching burden constantly. And it took me because I was just so grateful to come from my lowly position in a fucking dumpster to make my way into the halls of academia. And it was a dream come true for me. And I really let myself get taken advantage of. And it took me a long time to realize that there were just people who would come in that, I don't want to name any names or anything, but there's a story that I could tell about someone at some university, as an example, who, had almost no publications, but sat on absolutely every committee, all of the diversity committees and all of the, Athena Swan, gender, this and that, and was policing everyone's speech and language. Almost got a working class student who was quite a success story, almost got him in a ton of trouble because he had a habit of saying "my darling," so very sort of, and "my dear," very kind of working class way of speaking, and was like, "Oh, this is sexist language," this sort of thing, like this kind of, DEI kind of person. And this person managed to get all the way to, I think, professor with, very, very little in the way of publication. And you can do that. You can kind of make your way through if you show yourself to be committed to management strategies, to towing the line, that sort of thing. I'm not saying that happened at my university. It's just I've heard of this sort of thing happening. So please don't sue me if you recognize yourself in that story. But but this happens all the time. And I would notice, in order to get a promotion, you have to say oh, how did I change things? How do things change because of my involvement? So people would come through and just light stuff on fire. Look, I changed things. And we'd be putting out the fires, the people who were doing the teaching, that sort of thing. And that's kind of the reality of what academia is like. So when I heard the story of Claudine Gay, I was like, yeah, I recognize that person. I recognize that kind of climber who just, sits on all the committees, does the, toes the line, does all the right things, says all the right things, and makes their way up that way. And then it's just sort of kind of embarrassing when that internal kind of these internal strategies get exposed to the the mainstream, and people are like, what? This is Harvard. Although Harvard, I have to say, has been exposing some of its own rot for a long time, not just there. They've been selling their name, this sort of thing, and it's been on a downswing for a while. It's become it wants to be at the cutting edge, and therefore it picks up every fad possible and starts to become implicated in some pseudoscience-y things, but that's a whole other story. Anyway, so I recognize that figure in Claudine Gay. So why did I say at the beginning that she's a victim of cancel culture? Because what they eventually got her on. Why was she even subject to all of this media scrutiny? It's this playing dirty, right? It's, there are very few positions in academia generally. There are very few top spots. These are coveted positions, and elites are just squabbling amongst each other to boot each other out of these top spots. And how did they do that? They went low. They put all of her stuff through plagiarism checkers. And what they found was the infamous sloppy citations. It's not that she intentionally stole other people's work and passed it off as her own, but it was unclear where her ideas ended, her language ended and that of others began. That's sloppy citations. You go, oh, well, at Harvard, we expect the best. Yeah, true. But citations are not like an exact science. It's very, very difficult. You always have to walk this sort of line. Well, you don't want to cite too much. You want to back up what you're saying, right? You always want to do that. But if you cite too much, you're going to look unoriginal because people it's not always clear to people. Maybe it's clear to you, but it's not always clear to the reader, and you don't realize it until later exactly how that reference is being used. Are you using to back up the claim that you're making? Are you paraphrasing that person's words? You should make it fairly clear in your writing, but it's particularly early in your career. It's not an exact science. It's a bit of an art. And you could see that she was a bit uncomfortable with explaining her data. And so she used the words of somebody else to explain the data. Her data was completely different than this person's data, but she had used that person's words. Anyways, should have paraphrased better, definitely. Plagiarism in the sense of stealing someone's work, it was not. This is the letter of the law, not the spirit of the law. People are like, oh, but the students are being treated this way. You should too. Yeah, maybe. But I think that's sort of losing the significance of what's really going on here, which is that when somebody is in the firing line, any mistake is enough to destroy them. And that's the culture that we're living in right now. That's the culture that we've created. The left played dirty for so long. Anytime that somebody was in the spotlight with ideas they didn't like, they started to look through their tweets. They started to troll. They were looking for dirt. Aha, I got you. And they go, oh, it's so offensive. Look at this thing, barely concealing their glee when they found something offensive. Oh, I am deeply, deeply offended. They're so happy when they find something. There's a pretense here that's going on. And the left is getting a taste of their own medicine. And I feel very uncomfortable celebrating when I see these dirty tricks get played on anybody. I'd like to have an open and honest kind of culture in which when you disagree with somebody, you attack on the basis of your disagreement. If you disagree with, what she said about genocidal claim, whether or not genocide was enough to, break the code of conduct or whatever, and context is needed, let's have a discussion about that instead of trawling through her backlog, trying to delete her from public existence.
I
don't think I was being clear. Sorry. Sam Badger says, I don't think it's unique to the left. Everyone does it. No, yeah, exactly. That's the point. It's going across the political spectrum now. Everybody's doing it.
Yeah, I want to address that in a way, and also try to go a little deeper into the question of cancel culture and Claudine Gay through this article for the New York Magazine called "The Free Speech Debate is a Trap." It was written by Andrea Long Chu, and I think the first thing we need to do is dispense with the idea that when we say something like, oh, the left is getting a taste of its own medicine, we are referring to anything that is remotely like a socialist left or a libertarian left or a left that is struggling for fundamental societal change. I think what we should say is something like the Democratic Party is getting a taste of its own medicine, or the progressive bureaucrats are getting a taste of their own medicine, something like that, because I think that's more accurate.
Yeah, just to be clear here, I'm not saying like, yay, you're getting a taste of your own medicine. What I'm saying is, if that's how you're going to play, that's how the enemy is going to play. That's the point. So we shouldn't have been playing that game to begin with. That's what I'm saying. So when you want to play the free speech game, where you're like, look, only like such, you start like saying, no, that's not free speech because it's offensive, blah, blah, blah. Well, they're going to play the same game as you. Well, I'm offended by that, and if you want to start like shutting down free speech, to stop ideas that you don't like, to stop debates from happening that you don't want to happen, they're going to do the exact same thing to you when they get the upper hand. That's how it works. I've talked about this before in relation to Weber's concept of naked power. That's what happens. If you have said that there can be no consensus, there can be no bargaining, there can be no give and take, all it is naked power, crush the enemy using any means possible. Well, when the enemy gets the upper hand, they're going to do the exact same thing to you. That's where we are now. And it doesn't have to be like, there are some things, yes, naked power might be necessary, but we don't, not on every damn issue. And that's kind of where we've been going. We're like, oh, well, I can't win this debate. Excuse me. Sorry. I'm getting over like 3 weeks of sickness. I can't win this debate, and so I'm going to just, crush you. Well, that's what goes around winds up coming around. So stop playing dirty. Stop playing dirty. Have the confidence of the courage of your convictions, and argue it out. And sometimes that does mean you're going to have to bargain in a democratic society. On some other issues, maybe not.
Well, here's why I say we should not think of this as the left getting a taste of its own medicine. It's not because I can't enjoy some Schadenfreude once in a while. I have been, ratioed anyhow on Twitter for things I've said by people who are ostensibly part of the left. I can understand the sentiment, but I think we risk misunderstanding the phenomenon if we continue to think about this in terms of left and right. And certainly if we could think about this in terms of like the subcultural left, or the Marxist left, or the activist left getting a taste of its own medicine, I don't think any of that is quite right, because it gives too much independence to the activist left or the subcultural left, and misses the machine that is really driving the problem or setting up the issue. And I think that reading Andrea Long Chu, who is not a leftist, although I'm sure Andrea Long Chu identifies as a leftist, is worthwhile. There's a lot of really interesting and true points that Andrea raises. The problem, of course, is the ideological frame for the entirety of the thing, the way in which Andrea Long Chu tries to define the left and what the left's project is. But there's a lot of facts here or takes that are worth underlining, and also some things that are worth critiquing or rejecting, but that need to be examined. So the first thing I would say about this piece, and it's called The Free Speech Trap, The Free Speech Debate is a Trap, is that she frames this, the thing that the way to break the frame here is she frames this as a question of the left's primary values and why the left can't lose its values by embracing something abstract like the right to free speech. So this is what I would want to critique first as a leftist, because you cannot replace freedom for justice any more than you can replace freedom for safety. The role of the left is not to create justice. We're not in the business of judging. We're not here to right wrongs, historical wrongs. But rather, our task is to emancipate humanity, to free ourselves from these past conditions. And that is a rather abstract aim, because we don't know what we will be able to accomplish if we're free from the limits that are reified and kind of in a clandestine way imposed upon individuals and society through the capitalist mode of production. So our task is to free ourselves, to be able to create something new. It is not to right all the wrongs in the world or put the right people or the wrong people, the bad people in jail, or to in any way prioritize justice over freedom. So that's the first thing I would reject. And I know that's probably sounds questionable to a lot of people. I think I can justify it, but I'm going to start by saying that. But then to kind of dive into some of the factual side of her piece, she said some things that are worth exploring. For instance, she says, in truth, this poet, I think, who was disinvited to an event in New York at the 92 NY Global Center for Culture due to his signing of a letter in support of the Palestinian liberation struggle, and that was critical of Israel. She writes, in truth, he had no more right to speak at the 92 New York Global Center for Culture, a prestigious community center on the Upper East Side, than he has to be cast as Melissa Barra's replacement in Scream 7. Now, the point that's being raised there is that as a private entity, this Global Center for Culture has every right to decide who or who does not speak at their event. And they have no, there's no First Amendment violation. They have no obligation to use the First Amendment as the guide. And in fact, the other thing she points out is that when the university presidents said that that their policy on speech was guided by the United States Constitution, they were only describing a kind of institutional courtesy and not any actual obligation. The universities are private entities. They have no obligation to abide by the First Amendment. The Global Center for Culture is a private institution, has no obligation to abide by the strictures of the First Amendment. The First Amendment doesn't apply. In fact, it's quite the opposite. We protect the First Amendment by giving the Global Center for Culture the right to cancel this speech. That's the argument. But I think it's worth examining the degree to which our cultural industries, including probably Hollywood studios, are enmeshed with the state. So, for instance, the 92 New York Global Center for Culture is funded by a variety of foundations that play a role in the operations of the state. For instance, the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. So the head of that, let's see. So the executive committee that decided to block this poet from speaking was a member of the Bloomberg administration. He was head of the New York administrator. No, he was a New York administrator in education and art, which is an NGO that works alongside of and in a symbiotic relationship with the state. No, wait, I'm getting this confused. Sorry. So the head of the committee that runs the New York Global Center for Culture was formerly a member of the Bloomberg administration. Then the chair, Jody Gottfried Arnold, was part of the New York City Department of Education through an initiative. The Lawrence Belfer comes from a private investment firm and is the chair of the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at Harvard Kennedy School. That's a research institute that focuses on nuclear security, cybersecurity, climate change, and diplomacy. He has also been a supporter of the Aspen Institute, or his organization has been. The Aspen Institute is that institute that ran the tabletop exercise, training the media to suppress the Hunter Biden laptop story. There's another member of this board at the New York Global Center for Culture, Jennifer Hyman Milston. She was a senior analyst at Kroll Associates, a global risk consulting firm that provides investigative and security services to government agencies, and so on. So the point is that these cultural centers are run through foundations and often through federal grants or other kinds of grants that and are staffed by the same bureaucrats that run the state, and the state has an easy access to these institutions through these informal relationships.
So what you're saying is that effectively it is state censorship.
I wouldn't want to bring this to court, right? I wouldn't want to say, okay, in court, it's not the same as the kind of argument you can make about what happened with Twitter, right? It's not that direct, but rather it's structural. That they are enmeshed in the state. They are funded by the state. They are run through the same culture and sets of principles as the state. They change as the state changes, but I think that you couldn't legally claim that the First Amendment was being violated. I don't think it would hold up in court, but I'm not sure. I'm not a lawyer, but all I'm pointing to is, go ahead.
Look, the point is that when people say that, they're a private entity, they can do what they want. A couple of things strike me as hilarious about that. One, people who consider themselves leftists suddenly when it suits them, morph into Ayn Rand and sing the virtues of private enterprise. They can do whatever they want. So, and then also, as we have the encroachment of the private sphere into more and more of our everyday lives, then where's the space for freedom then? People say, oh, well, you're on the clock. Do you really have the freedom? You fucking worker, how dare you think, I'm a leftist. I'm a real good leftist. You lowly workers, how dare you think that you have freedom when I'm paying you? I mean, they're paying you. Anyway, so that's the one silly thing about that. Second, when it doesn't suit them and they're the ones being suppressed, then they start freaking out. So when Elon Musk half-heartedly said that cis is now a slur and would be banned from the platform, everyone flipped out. Well, you said they're private enterprise, they do whatever they want. So, okay, then you've got nothing to stand on. The other thing is that when they say, they have no obligation to allow this speaker, they know full well. It's not like this person showed up and was like, hey, let me speak. I demand. No, they were invited to speak, and you activists pressured the organization not to allow them to. That's what happened. We all know that that's what happened. You made it so that there would be consequences for that organization if they allowed a particular conversation you did not want to have transpire. That's what happened. And now you're going, well, they can do what they want because you pressured them and tried to use every lowly tactic in the book. Okay, so then when it happens to you, don't complain. When it happens to you and people stand and thugs in brown shirts stand outside a venue and say, you Jew, you can't speak. Well, they can do what they want, right? No, they're just responding to, that they don't want consequences. Freedom of speech isn't freedom from consequences. The people from brown shirts are going to show up. That's just, that's just consequences. Fine. Mm-hmm. That's a society you want to live in. That's the one that you've created. Mm-hmm. When you stand up for free speech, you have to stand up for your enemies as well, because when your enemies are in power, they're going to do the same thing to you. And we keep seeing this happen. This is what happened. Yes, it's tempting to say, schadenfreude, Claudine Gay. But that's what happened to Claudine Gay. You use those tactics, they get used against you. Let's just grow the fuck up and actually talk about stuff, okay? You disagreed with what she said. Chris Catrone said in the comments, the reason why she pussyfooted around the question of genocide and so on is because she didn't want to get Harvard in trouble. Okay, let's have that conversation. Don't trawl through her backlog, trawl through people's backlogs to try to get them in shit. This happened with Aaron Bastani too. Someone like trawled through his PhD trying to find something and couldn't find anything. And so they were like, well, I heard he wrote it in 6 months, ergo he shouldn't get a PhD. You know, they were just trying absolutely anything to say, you don't belong here. You're not one of us. Or I'm going to throw you out of like polite conversation using dirty, underhanded tactics. Just stop, grow up, meet people at the level of their ideas, their bad ideas, their crappy weaseling out of things. Meet them there. Okay. Because do you want that used against you? Do you want those tactics? You're going to play dirty. That's the game that you've invited your enemy to play too.
Mm-hmm. Well, look, here, my point. I mean, I totally agree about the principles here. And I definitely think that, you have to grant the abstract right to free expression, even to your enemies, or else you really don't believe in free expression and free speech. I totally get that and agree. And of course, we're on the same page. But the question of whether or not we have a realm of freedom as we're meant to under the First Amendment is still kind of an open question, given the way in which the state has encroached into so many aspects of civil society through NGOs and foundations and these other institutions. So, like two things I want to talk about. I want to quote Chris Catrone on 2 points. One is that Chris Catrone got in trouble lately for talking about the Palestinian Israeli conflict as something that arose as a necessity from the political order that had been established historically, that it was a consequence of that, rather than as a moral wrong, right? And he didn't mean that he was endorsing the Palestinian-Israeli conflict or that thought that Israel was right to bombard Gaza or anything like that. But what he was saying was, if you want to understand and undo this situation, you have to look at what sets it up as a kind of necessity in society. So I'm kind of trying to do something similar here by pointing out that these institutions and NGOs, these neoliberals, but nonetheless statist, and that's the other thing I want to quote Chris Catrone on. Catrone says, it isn't the case that we went from a statist society to a neoliberal one, but rather we went to a neoliberal statist society. And so what we should understand is the way in which the state, being fully integrated with cultural and private publishing entities like big tech companies, but also even these little community centers, so-called little community centers, which are funded by the big philanthropists, how they're all kind of integrated into the same bureaucratic machinery and the culture that it produces is worth noting. So that we can combat it and combat it on a level other than a moral injunction, right? Like, you should be for free speech or you should be against free speech. Neither is going to be enough. It's like, how do we get to, what do we need to combat in order to create the conditions for free speech is sort of what I'm trying to aim at. But can I say one more thing? Okay, go ahead.
You need to trust that people can hear speech and reflect on it. I mean, if you don't trust that people are reflective, then you're not going to be for free speech. And I think most people think the masses are all stupid, not me. I'm not part of the masses. And we need to sort of protect ourselves from the masses lest they go out of control. And there's this, deep-seated belief that, Nazism was democracy out of control, and this needs to be kept, under wraps, too much democracy, et cetera, which is incredibly ironic that exactly what the Nazis said became the lesson that we all took from World War II. Anyway.
But look, the thing about that is that you can be against free speech and also trust that people have the critical faculties, can listen to speech and reflect on it and come to good conclusions. You can be against people coming to good conclusions. And I think these institutions are to a large extent. I mean, they don't think of it that way exactly, but they don't have the same interests as the mass of people. They don't want people to rebel. They don't want people to try to make changes. And one of the things that was said in this, the free speech debate is a trap, that I think is worth highlighting. I wrote it down as a kind of delusion, but she wrote, a number of powerful people in America currently believe that talking about freeing Palestine could actually end up freeing Palestine. And it is this cascade of actions that they're ultimately trying to suppress. So I think that the way in which the Palestinian-Israeli conflict is being talked about, and the way in which it is being politically conceived, is extremely unlikely to lead to the emancipation of Palestinians. However, I also believe that it's the case that the suppression of the protesters is about protecting the status quo, as the neoconservatives and other foreign policy DC consensus types see it, and that they're really but suppressing political speech is a matter of limiting real political options. So that is the aim. Like when they say that Seymour Hersh's article on the Nord Stream pipeline is disinformation, and censor it online, and put up an alert when you try to share it saying, if you share this, you're sharing disinformation and you will be suppressed, not only this time but going forward. When they make those kinds of moves, they're not doing it because they don't trust people to be able to see through the disinformation that Seymour Hersh is putting forward, but rather because they have their own disinformation, which they're trying to protect in order to cover up what's actually happening around the war in Ukraine. That's my perspective. Not to say that Seymour Hersh was absolutely right, but rather just that the question shouldn't be open. It should not be left to the people to discover what the truth is, because that will lead to political consequences that the established order cannot bear. So anyway.
Okay. Yeah, that's true. The more disturbing thing is not that nefarious forces conspire to keep the truth away from the masses lest they make a better world, but that they think they are making a better world. And I think this is the thing that is very disturbing. It's easy to imagine that those in power are evil and have bad intentions, and that they're sort of in a dark room going, hey, 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 and like twiddling their mustache or something. But that's, the scarier thing is that a lot of evil happens in the world when people think they're doing the right thing and when they're guided by the right thing. So, even people who like wage wars, they do it guided by what they think is the best interests of their country or the future or whatever it might be. It takes a lot to get people to do terrible things. And often it takes a lot of belief in the goodness of what you're doing. So when people are like fighting against communism, even, they are doing it because they think it's evil. They think it's going to destroy the world. They think capitalism is the best possible world. And you got to do what you got to do to maintain that, because the evil that you would unleash would be much, much worse. You think, you have to do evil to do good, essentially. So I think it's that, yes, people might believe in the rationality of the masses, though I don't think that. I think if you like go through sort of policy documents at government level, they're sort of riven with this notion that most people are quite stupid and make bad choices, and that their behaviors have to be carefully guided. I think that's a pretty common outlook, and they would say that about themselves as well. But even if they believe in the rationality of people, I think they believe more in that they're kind of, yes, they might be reasonable, but their reasons are wrong. They're getting things wrong, and they risk, if we let them have power or if we let this information out, they'll draw the wrong conclusion and bad things will happen. The United States economy is heavily tied, for instance, to the pharmaceutical industry. It is in the interest, they would believe, of the vast majority of Americans that industry prospers. And if a few people, bad people somewhere else have to die, well, it's the price they're willing to pay. That's just politics. That's just, what you got to do as a person in power. What is it? The heavy is the head that wears the crown.
Yeah, I wasn't trying to say that these people who sit on these boards have evil intent, but rather that they share a view of the truth, which they are, and which may be, like you said, goes beyond the immediate. Like, sometimes innocent people have to die in the name of this truth, and then that has to be covered up. Not because they're evil people, but just because, for the greater good, you had to kill some civilians and then you had to cover it up. For the greater good, you had to arrest Julian Assange and put him in prison for, exposing the reality that the occupation of Iraq included casual murder on a daily basis from on high by soldiers who approached the activity as a kind of game, as a joke. That's the footage that really went viral back in early 2000s, and before there was even, I think it was before there was Facebook. But anyway, this footage of helicopter pilots just killing a bunch of farmers and civilians while laughing. That was exposed by WikiLeaks. That was true, and the people who wanted to suppress that story and who wanted to get rid of Julian Assange, they didn't think it wasn't true. They knew it was true, but they thought, in the interest of the war effort, which was the ultimate good, an ultimate good that they didn't probably even let themselves question enough to defend, they went after Assange. So this is the reality we're living in. Like, one of the great outcomes that we could maybe hope for if we were to be able to transform society and overcome this mode of production would be the liberation of our thinking as well, because we are constrained both materially and through a cultural industry, which makes a great effort to frame things for us and to limit the kinds of information we can get, and so on. Not a conspiracy. It's a result of the concentration of capital leads to a certain kind of concentration of the mind. Would you disagree with that?
Well, okay. I mean, we don't live in a direct relationship with our means of subsistence and the reproduction of ourselves, and this leads to a lot of difficulty in thinking things through. Yeah, absolutely. And the future hopefully holds a more direct relationship between that, and therefore a lot more clarity of thinking. Perhaps I would say that. Now, I wanted to say what I said before about people being driven by good intentions. I'm not saying people are only driven by good intentions. Obviously, there's obviously a lot of naked self-interest at play. There's possibly sadistic evil at play. There are all sorts of interests at play in society, but you don't have to impute the enemy with bad intentions and evil. And I think that's important, because I think if your socialism requires an evil other, you're treading into dangerous territory. Your socialism or Marxism or communism, prefer much more the Marxism and communism, because there's too much socialism around that's just like sort of bereft of Marxism, and I think that's not good for a variety of reasons, obviously. But if you're, your Marxism or communism needs to be focused on systems. You don't need to impute like good intentions or bad intentions or have a whole theory of intentions in order to understand capitalism. You can be a good person, you can be a bad person, but at the end of the day, the system will force you on pain of destruction to do certain things. It becomes economically rational to invest in bullets if it is not economically rational to invest in bridges. Okay, you're going to do that because your capital sitting idle is capital that's it's not capital. Your money sitting idle depreciates. Things have got to always be in motion. Capital has to constantly be in motion. If you do not, do extreme things, when the profit rate starts to get lower and lower and lower, you're going to go out of business. You're going to have to be a worker yourself. So the system will push your hand to do various things, and those things can be
Right.
very, very evil. And there's also this degree of distance too that allows for this kind of evil to happen, because what are you really doing at the end of the day? Maybe you're signing some documents, maybe you're investing in some stocks. These days, maybe you even have an app on your phone. There's and then somewhere down the line, this evil happens. And it's the same thing with the drones, that what you mentioned before with the footage being released. It takes a lot to get a human being to murder another human being at close range. It's always been a problem. People lose heart on the battlefield quite frequently. And so you need something to get something big to get people to kill each other. You have an us or them ideology. Well, you got to kill this person or they're going to kill you and everyone you love. You have, or religious ideology, and since people are so anti-ideological for such a long time, there's not really much that we believe in beyond the self. In fact, the US military knows this and has tried to use mindfulness to try to overcome some of this problem. They're like, oh, these fucking people don't have religion or they don't care about anything. I know. So they try to use all these different things to try to overcome this. But drone technology allows them to overcome this. Or these, it's just a video game. It's not a real human being. You're not watching this person eyes. You're not seeing them eye to eye while you're murdering them. It makes it that much easier to do it and laugh. So all of these sorts of things are what we need to understand how evil transpires in capitalism. It's not just sort of like evil people that want to shut down us do-gooders who want a better world. Often they believe that what they're doing is the right thing, or they are compelled by naked self-interest, or they're compelled by the need to make a profit, they're beholden to their shareholders. All of these sorts of things are sort of, or they have a certain amount of distance from their target. All of these things are bound up with how evil transpires in capitalist society. You need to be very, very careful about sort of saying like, oh, it's these evil, bad people who are trying to suppress our free speech, who are trying to dispossess us. Yeah, at the end of the day, what they're doing is evil, but it's not out of you don't have to impute evil intentions to understand how it all works.
Yeah, I totally agree. But what I guess what I'm trying to get at is that the way to read this piece about the free speech debate, the free speech debate is a trap, is to read it as like a memo from the bureaucracy itself, rather than as a critique of society from the left. This is an insider describing the situation, both her own ideology and the reality of working within the culture industry, I think is how I would put it. And so there are a lot of things that are true in the piece that it's, if you can separate them from the ultimate frame, which is I'm defining the left, and the left should be for justice, and we don't need to worry about something abstract like the First Amendment or free speech, but rather that's a nice idea, but really what we have to do is struggle for power within the system. That's ultimately what is being said here, and that is the thought that's on the right and the left. I think that's probably an idea that's shared, although perhaps more on what's called the left than on the right. But the other thing that's being exhibited is the way in which the concept of free speech, the principles on which the First Amendment are founded, have been abandoned by the state, by the bureaucratic, unelected state. And that this is an expression of the ideology that's replaced the free speech ideology, the constitutional approach to government. So, and an example is the way in which this article is a regression, or is being written as if some of the victories of the 20th century hadn't taken place. So, for instance, she cites Gitlow versus New York from 1925. And this is a case where the Supreme Court upheld a conviction of a socialist journalist for advocating the overthrow of the government. I'm paraphrasing her there. Please don't get me for plagiarism. So anyway, this is important to note that this is what she cites as she tries to describe or buttress an argument that all speech is incitement, and actually all speech counts as a real action. That you can't separate speech from violence. Ultimately, I think is what she's hinting at. But she cites this Supreme Court case, Kitlow versus New York. Since then, there's been the Brandenburg versus Ohio decision, which overturned the standard of clear and present danger, which wasn't fully operative, but which was in the background of the 1925 decision, for another standard, which is imminent lawless action, which is basically John Stuart Mill's harm principle. If you advocate something and incite something that it happens imminently, like go burn down that house, that's not free speech. But if you say we should burn down the houses and the mansions of the billionaire class, that is free speech. So that distinction has been lost in this piece, and it's been lost, I think, for reasons that she describes. The way in which what's actually happening is a struggle for power within the state bureaucracy, and it is kind of front and center in this article on the free speech trap. So I just wanted to kind of think about that and express what I was thinking about that, because I
Yeah,
do
the
think
idea,
that.
like,
Go
sorry,
ahead.
go ahead.
Go
Yeah.
ahead.
No, no,
Go,
no.
no,
You
no,
do think, sorry.
no.
Yeah, this whole idea that speech is violence. Okay, so then if these things are equal, then it's okay to oppose speech with violence. And we've already seen people doing that, right? They've given themselves a carte blanche to go ahead and be violent to people saying things that they don't like. That's not not a great kind of world you want to be living in, where you can get punched in the face. It's not really freedom of speech if you've threatened everyone from every different angle, and they're sort of sitting there like, and I always use the line, which I've tried to find the exact quote, the exact place that I read this, but I've not been able to find it. So I apologize for the poorly sourced quote, but apparently Mussolini had said at one point that they had done away with censorship in fascist Italy because people censored themselves before they spoke. People thought before they spoke. And that's not a free society. We can lie to ourselves and say, look, it's fine because we don't have to actively engage. State doesn't have to actively engage in censorship. Why? Because some thug's going to come punch you in the face if you say the wrong thing. Fantastic. But also, I think this idea too that like what happened with Mill's harm principle is that it led to this sort of harm industry. And I've talked about this before, but if your right to swing your fist stops where my face begins, bastardization of that quote, then people start saying, well, oh no, the limitation of freedom is harm. So then they start going around and manufacturing all these different kinds of harms. Oh yes, okay, so it doesn't okay, you might not be physically hurting me, but psychological harm is just the same as physical harm, is it not? Are you denying that that mental harms are real? And you're like, well, no, I'm not. And then okay, now we've equated psychological harm with physical harm, and so now you don't have the freedom to say things that, and this has actually happened in Ireland. And lots of countries are now looking to, and the left does not at all oppose this, by the way. The sort of hate speech ideas, which are based on the eye of the beholder. It's like, if you feel that you have been harmed, then the speech was harmful, and that's it. It can be shut down, and that's a complete degradation of freedom of speech. But also, it leaves out the fact that like you are capable. Like if you slap me across the face, it's gonna hurt regardless of what I think about it. Whereas if you tell me something, whether or not it hurts depends on how I understand it. There's always a kind of mediation and interpretation of things. Whereas, physical pain doesn't have that. But anyways, this sort of equation of that led to this kind of this harm industry. So people are constantly sort of manufacturing new kinds of harms and eroding different kinds of freedoms. And of course, they think in the interest of justice. And some of the worst movements historically also had the interests of justice in mind, and law and order and the common good and all of that, and even the community. These sorts of things, we imagine that. I'm sorry to bring everything back to the Nazis. I'm sorry, but we imagine that the Nazis were like, haha, I am evil and I have decided that I am better than everyone else. And now I'm feeling murdery. And no, they had a conception of justice. They talked about social justice, that this would be that their kind of socialism was the only path to allowing justice to reign. They believed in the goodness of what they were doing. They believed in us or them. If I don't do it, they're going to do it. These are not good ideologies. This is not the socialism that we want to be upholding. And we want to uphold the socialism that the Nazis fucking hated, which was class-based, the religion of mammonism, fiercely material, believed in a better, materially better world, believed in the community for the freedom of the individual, not the individual subordinated to the community, which is a Nazi slogan. That believed in the progressive force of capitalism, in its ability to create a new society, these sorts of things, not like the kind of socialism that just says, well, no, actually, there's a difference between finance capital, which is run by the Jews, and industrial capital, this sort of thing. That it has a deeper kind of structural understanding that believes in human beings, believes in democracy, and the realizing democracy to its fullest. That's the kind of communism that we want. It's the believes in human freedom and the human subject that's capable of bearing that freedom.
Well, the thing that's interesting to me about this free speech debate article is that it isn't a repeat of some of the arguments like, speech causes harm psychologically, therefore we have to protect people's psychological health, or those kinds of things. It is operating on the level of it's speaking in the context of the Congress and this billionaire going after the Harvard presidents and calling for their dismissal from the state. So it seems like a direct state intervention to police the culture, right? And she talks about that, how they are trying, by creating these blacklists, they're not only trying to immediately censor ideas, but determine the character of the class, of the political class, directly by the state. So, we are going to decide what the future ideology within the state bureaucracy will be by intervening now to weed out people for the wrong ideas from ever having a chance to be admitted into the halls of power. So we're gonna police. What we're gonna do is police the thoughts of the state bureaucracy and the political class from the state. So that's what she describes as having happened. Okay, and then her response is, we need to fight back and take that power. We need to make sure that the transphobes aren't the ones who get to be in the state bureaucracy. We need to not abandon our notions of justice. And in striking back from the supposed left position, what she's doing is accepting massive state intervention and control of thought and in society, and the abandonment of freedom itself as a political aim. So, and I just think it's worth noting what that means, not for the left, but for the state bureaucracy and the powers that be that the left is really, I hope, still organizing against. And what that means is we're facing a more authoritarian moment overall. The Republicans never really were reliable allies on the free speech issue, but because they were the minority party, there was a moment there where they seemed to be wanting to stand up for the abstract idea of free expression for all citizens and for the First Amendment. I think that moment is passing or has passed. So within the state, there really isn't a party that has any political interest in holding on to the constitutional order in the United States right now. And then so the thing about what she cited, I think I may have already brought this up, but she cited an old Supreme Court decision from 1925. That means this is a regressing back. Regressing back to when socialists didn't have the protection of the Brandenburg versus Ohio decision. And this is what the left wants to do, to go back to the point in history where socialists could get locked up for what they said. And I mean, specifically, that's who she mentions, is a socialist who gets locked up. So I just think that's all worth noting as we move ahead. And it's all kind of a bummer. But I do think that's how you should read the Claudine Gale. I'm sorry, the Claudine Gay moment. It's not that we got revenge on Claudine Gay. It's not that Claudine Gay is on the left, but just that there's a split within the ruling class around Palestine and Israel. But what there is no longer split about is whether or not we need to go beyond the constitutional order. That's what I would argue. Is that clear at all?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that someone in the comments said, you're missing one of the most important arguments for free speech. Yes, of course, we're missing almost all of the most important arguments for free speech. We're just focusing on a couple of different things. Like, could go on and on and on about why you should have free speech. People go, oh, well, no one's ever convinced. Even if no one was convinced, like, your arguments get better, by debating people. You find holes in what you're saying and so on. It's difficult, it sucks, but it's necessary. The other thing too is that so yes, there are many, many different arguments for free speech that we're not touching on. I know. Mm-hmm. The other thing is that when the author of this article, whose name escapes me for the moment, sorry, it is Andrea Long Chu. Mm-hmm. When Long Chu argues that that we have to think about justice and so on, what she is implicitly saying is that people like her are trustworthy, and maybe solely people like her are trustworthy to be the arbiters of justice. And if they claim that something is just, then it should be allowed. It should be free. So I mean, this speech, I am here to judge. Is it just? Is it in service of justice? Okay, then it can be free. And you see this argument a lot where people are like, well, like, why would you say that? And you're like, well, that, you're like, you're being illiberal by banning this particular thing. And people go, well, why would you do that? I don't fucking know, because I wanted to that day. Not everything that I do has to be in service of some justice objective. And you see, they really reveal their true colors of neoliberalism, where every fucking thing has to be a KPI. Everything is a key performance indicator. Everything that you do has to be in service of some objective. And they're sitting there, little bureaucrats, they have a point on the checklist. Are you meeting your key performance indicators every single day of your life? Every waking moment? Are you meeting justice? Are you creating a better world as I have defined it? No, okay. No, not allowed. I'm afraid not. This is what life is becoming. And people go, well, why would you do that? Because that's life. Because sometimes in life, you want to make a cartoon that looks cool to you. That's it. And it might be offensive to other people, but you really like the way the breasts look. All right. I'm not here to decide whether or not it should be free because it's in the service of the common good or justice or whatever. You're free in a free society to draw boobs. Okay. And if somebody wants to publish them, then okay, subject to particular, laws of pornography, etc. But it doesn't have to be in service of a general good. We can come up with other reasons and restrictions like pornography and so on. But the restriction is not some arbiter of justice has decided that it's worthwhile and therefore should be allowed, that it suits some objective and some indicator.
Chris Catron is in the chat, and he says campus conduct codes are not First Amendment issues. And to the degree to which campus conduct codes are not influenced by the federal government, that's true. But I think things like Title IX and other legislation from the state, from the federal government, may come into conflict with the First Amendment rights of students and the degree to which the universities are pressured to enact certain conduct codes is the degree to which the state, pressure by the state is the degree to which there's a constitutional question. So I don't know if this has been litigated already around Title IX, but it's not so clear that you can easily what my whole point all throughout this stream has been to say, it really is not very clear the degree to which private culture still exists in this very statist society. I mean, I'll give you another example quickly. The Dr. Seuss censorship story. Do you remember that one?
Yes. Yeah.
Dr. Seuss was censored by Dr. Seuss. The Dr. Seuss estate decided to pull like 6 titles, 2 of which I had read to my kids. It was and to think that I saw it on Mulberry Street, and If I Owned the Zoo, or If I Ran the Zoo, or something like that. And it, there's First Amendment claims. That's crazy. It was self-censorship, if anything, right? However, the Dr. Seuss estate was partnered with federal initiatives for literacy for children. Let's see if I've got some of the kind of facts on this here. So the Dr. Seuss estate had a close working relationship with the federal bureaucracy. That would be through the Federal Striving Readers Comprehensive Literacy Program and Read Across America Day. Dr. Seuss was the featured author for Read Across America Day. It was scheduled for to happen on Dr. Seuss's birthday. The books that he wrote were considered easy reading books, a good way to introduce young children to literacy. And through these programs and this presidentially declared Read Across America Day, Dr. Seuss got a boost in sales, and I think every year or on a regular rotation. And so the degree to which there had been a critique of Dr. Seuss that arose from the university sector, which is also, not that distinguishable from the state bureaucracy anymore, and that influenced the thinking of not just the people who are part of the Federal Striving Readers Comprehensive Literacy Program, but also those politicians and bureaucrats whose support you would need to continue to get funding for those programs. Then pressure came to bear on the Dr. Seuss estate, especially in the context of a Biden administration, which was wanting to placate its progressive wing and not be associated unnecessarily with bad think. So you had, even in the case of a self-censoring of the Dr. Seuss estate, there was a mechanism within the state that was consequential, I think, that had direct bearing on the question. It was not happening outside of the context of a statist society. And so we need to think about that. We need to think about the degree to which the First Amendment can be applied in this society. And that doesn't mean we don't continue to struggle to protect it. It just means we should not be complacent about censorship, even when it appears at first glance to be happening only in the private sector amongst free agents and not be directed by.
Yeah, and also stop asking everyone to play dumb. We know, everybody knows what's going on. Everybody knows that you're using social pressure to stop particular conversations that you don't want to happen. That's it. You know that. You're like, oh, well, they can do what they want. Yeah, because they're doing what you want, and it's going to come back to bite you, because eventually they're not going to do what you want. Capitalists, not my friends. I'm shocked. Anyway, we have to go to the Patreon, and there's a whole bunch. There's a whole bunch of comments, a ton of comments coming in on our chat. One of them is someone said, there's a reason. So someone's very mad at the working class, and it was a pair Mew Mew is very mad at the working class, obviously been very disappointed by the working class. and said, there's a reason why people who want the world to care about each other drop out, smoke weed, go to university, etc. There's your first mistake. You think the answer is to get the world to care about each other. No. And
Maybe. We'll talk
I
about
shall
that.
elaborate. Okay.
Yeah. I had one last thought, but I'll try to remember it for the parent room. But yeah, I've put the link, I think, already in the description for this video. I'll put a comment in with the link, and I hope that we can continue to explore this. I also may bring up the Great Replacement theory. So if people want to be really inflamed, they can come and see me do that. All right, I'll see you all in the parent room. I remember my last comment. If you are talking to a leftist and the leftist says to you, I don't care about free speech, I care about justice, they're not a part of the left. They may think they are, but what they are a part of is the status quo of society.
A long tradition going back to the 19th century and reaching its apex in the 1930s. Anyway.
All right.
Sorry.
All right.